where it sits with Akshay Anand, and delighted to be talking to you in person again.
I know, it's amazing. People are three-dimensional once again.
Yes, yeah. Well, some people are still two-dimensional, like me. Interesting times, and just thought it'd be good to have a chat, because you've moved from Axelos to one of the vendors, and be interested to get a little bit of your perspective there, because went through that whole process in creating ITIL 4, which was a huge, monumental enterprise.
Yep.
And just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of where we are now with that, and how you see it through the lens, if you like, of a vendor.
Yep.
What does the vendor see in that, if anything?
Yep.
So, I mean, start with that. I mean, what do you think? Let's just start with what your reflection would be on what you think the real success was coming out of ITIL 4.
Sure. So you're right. ITIL 4 was a massive effort, massive collective effort of a lot of people around the world.
Yeah.
Whether you were an architect, an author, a reviewer, exam question writer, whether you took part in train-the-trainer sessions or some of the sort of enablement sessions that I did around the world, there's a massive amount of work that went into it. And I and a lot of other people are justifiably very proud of what we did. I think it's had really good uptake. I think the ITSM community was looking for what's the new evolution to this established way of working, a brand that we're familiar with, a body of knowledge that we're familiar with. What's the next evolution? How do we modernize to meet the demands of today and possibly tomorrow? And that's what we built into ITIL 4. That said, I see some of the same patterns that happened with ITIL version 3 that led to its eventual being shouldered aside, happening in IT service management with ITIL 4, and perhaps with other frameworks as well. And what I mean by that is a lot of people in the ITIL v3 world stopped at Foundation, right? They were sent on Foundation because their company might have sent them to. A lot of them might have been genuinely interested in it. And Foundation is just that. It's a basic recap of everything at a very, very high level. And when you do things at a high level, you never get to explore the nuances, the subtleties, the context of doing it one way here and another way there. There's not enough time to cover that in Foundation. That's why the upper levels are always built, whether it was an ITIL version 2, 3, or 4. But I see the same thing happening to an extent with ITIL 4 again, that a lot of people are going on Foundation, but not that many are going to create, deliver support, or high velocity IT, or digital IT strategy. The numbers are there, and I don't know what the numbers are. As you said, I left Axelos quite a long time ago. It's not my place to say what the numbers are, but I see the same sort of patterns starting to creep in, which, for people like you and me who worked on the actual guidance, is disappointing, because we want to get that guidance out there in front of as many people as possible to help them improve their day-to-day work.
Do you think we need more bite-sized versions or applications, and I don't mean that in terms of software, but just bits of that content that can that are more accessible? Because and I think we're never going to get away from the majority of people doing Foundation and it sort of tapering, but how would we get more, from your perspective? What do you think would be a good way of getting more engagement at that level?
It's a very interesting question. I think you'd have to dive into sort of the dynamics of the commercial training market, consulting market, etc., which I don't think we have time for in a very brief conversation such as this. But I agree that the way people want to learn now, the way people want to apply their knowledge now, is very different from how this IT service management training and consultancy industry emerged from 20 years ago. But I don't think very many people have gotten onto it. The other challenge, I think, is that when it comes to tooling, no tool is going to mirror what ITIL says, right? Because the tool has to be adapted, adopted, all that sort of good stuff we talk about, which means that people will have to understand that they're going to learn a theory here in a classroom, but what they see, what they touch in their day-to-day work might look very different. how would you reconcile that? I'm not sure I have the answer, but I know a lot of us who have worked in this space for many years talk about how practitioners in general have to apply more critical thinking. They have to be a bit more self-aware about what's happening around them rather than just blindly following what's put in front of them.
Taking it, yeah. Okay, I mean that's interesting. Just moving on then to the if you like, the vendor perspective. I mean, going into that kind of organisation, I mean, what's the difference, if you like, in terms of approach? Because I mean, there it's very much, yeah, we've got stuff that does stuff practically rather than creating content slightly in the abstract.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see any opportunities for better sharing of ideas or knowledge? Do you think that there's a good level of integration there at the moment, other than vendors just going, we've got an ITIL inside kind of badge?
Yeah. I mean, of course, there's always opportunities to improve. I think working at a tool vendor now provides some very interesting opportunities to work with organizations who are across the spectrum in terms of, for lack of a better word, maturity. So we work equally with companies which are really far left outfield, who are really trailblazing in the ways of what we would call futuristic service management. But at the same time, we're working with companies who are still very much in, dare I say it, even in the ITIL V2 way of thinking, service delivery and service support, not even the sort of service life cycle for that matter. And so it's very interesting to see how the same tool, the same concepts can be stretched and applied and massaged to fit different mental models, different iterations of the same framework. At the same time, there's also an opportunity to take some of those learnings and come back to the bodies of knowledge to say, look, this is what we're seeing in the field. We're seeing this more often than others. So is this now something that we can consider to be the new best practice or the new good practice? So there's a feedback loop that needs to be built. And that's part of what I was doing at Axelos, and that's what I'm going to be doing hopefully for the rest of my career as well.
What do you think that the vendor industry, particularly in the service management industry, what do you think they could be doing more of? And I don't mean any vendors in particular, but just in terms of approach, and maybe to answer some of the earlier points as well, just to help to develop better understanding.
It's an interesting question. I think I'd probably off the top of my head say community building. I know that pretty much every tool vendor does community building now, but it's community building around technical topics, right? Let's come together and share our best practices or practices around administering the tool or configuring this sort of thing or building an integration. Whereas I think we can uplift the whole community by sort of saying, let's now talk about solutions, let's talk about value engineering, let's talk about outcomes and how you can achieve that. Because when you start talking at that level, you can then bring in topics such as mental health and mental well-being, or physical health and physical well-being. You start talking about the human-tech interface, not just the tech itself. And you're sort of stepping into a wider world and making people more aware that there's a wider thing out there that they have to pay attention to. It's not just the tech that they're touching and working with. So yeah, I would say community building in that sense is probably where I wish tool vendors would go.
That's a good point, because we've always talked about, well, it used to be people process technology, but that idea that you needed to do work around, you can just buy a tool and stick it in, but that's always been very focused on process still, and other types of capability, but actually not the human part, the human. At the same time, we've got this merging world of robots and AI and stuff kind of going. I mean, do you think we can square that circle? I mean, do you think these things can coexist?
They do coexist today, but they're being managed very independently. They're being managed in silos, and I hope that as a community we can come together to figure out a way to bring these different perspectives together in a sort of a coherent way. I was speaking with, I forget who it was, late last year, and I was saying to him that look, if we look at some of the current quote-unquote thought leaders in our community in service management and adjacent communities, DevOps, Agile, etc., there are a lot of very, very clever people out there. But if I look at the work that they're producing, it's about, for example, incident response at a technical level. It's about managing the flow of software features at a technical level. I'm saying, well, so who's coming up with or who's articulating the best practices for managing customers and human people today? It's not just about the technology. At the end of the day, there's a person there who's being impacted positively or negatively. So who's talking about how you're managing that stakeholder, not just the technology?
And do you think this industry is moving in that direction enough?
To an extent, parts of the industry are. I think organizations that are recognizing that the old ways aren't going to be enough anymore, they need to rethink their ways of working. I think they're moving into that space, maybe not as fast as we would like them to, but they're definitely moving there. But let's face it, there are many, many organizations around the world of different sizes for whom the sort of traditional command and control, for lack of a better phrase, has worked, and it continues to work for them today. What is their incentive to change? Right? And until we can address that, provide a good, compelling answer to that, they are not going to change.
I mean, the change in the demographic, I think, should be the driver for that, in terms of what people expect, the kind of interfaces that they expect, or the kind of experiences they expect.
This is true, but then, what is a typical time frame before a new starter would get promoted to the point where he can influence that sort of thing, right? We're talking about 10, 15 years, right? So the movement, the sort of cultural ways of working explosion that the DevOps movement started, that's about 7 years old, thereabouts right now, which means we still have to wait for another 7, maybe 10 years before the new starters who are impacted by that are going to be in a place of position of authority and influence to be able to change the way an entire company is working. So we've got to wait for that generation to move along fast now. And that's what I'm saying. We can either wait for that, or we can find a way to get to the current managers in those companies and say, yes, this has worked for you for decades, it continues to work for you, but here's a compelling reason you have to change. And until we find that answer, we're not going to get them to change.
Okay, so it's a long game that we're playing. Yeah.
It is. Cultural change at such a massive scale is always going to be a long game.
Okay. On that note, I think we'll leave it there. Akshay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Barclay, for having me.
We'll see you again on either on the podcast or at the next show.
I look forward to it.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone out there, thanks for taking the time to listen to me, and it's wonderful to see people again in person. If you have an opportunity to come over to a conference, wherever you are in the world, make the most use of it. Network with your peers, network with the industry. It'll help tenfold, trust me.
I'll get my coat.